What has prompted the most recent underquoting reforms? What impact will it have on the market? I'm Dion Bessa and this is Beyond the Deal. Welcome to the show. Joining me to break down the topic, we are joined by Nicole Rich from Consumer Affairs. Nicole, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dion.
Nicole, underquoting, a big topic in the press at the moment. What has prompted all these new legislation, all these changes to the legislation?
Well, look, I think it's been a hot topic for many years, hasn't it? It's not not just recently.
Or 20 years.
Well, indeed.
Yeah.
And I think, the most significant reforms were introduced, back in 2017 now. So for at least that long, it's been, one of the priority topics for government reform. And I guess since that time, we've seen new laws, new activity, and now this most recent announcement. So what's prompted it is, I guess, ongoing complaints and frustrations that the government hears about in the market.
So there's a lot of complaints coming in through Consumer Affairs. There's obviously been a few studies, the most recent one done by The Age.
Yeah.
The impression in the marketplace is that there is an enormous amount of underquoting going on. Of all these studies and all this data you've got, how many actual underquoting circumstances are there?
Yeah, I think that's the big question.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, because just because a property sells above, say, the advertised range, I think that's well known, that's not necessarily proof of underquoting. Obviously, it's something that can frustrate buyers, but sometimes that can be that, they're just very popular on the day or something like that. Sometimes it can be an indication of underquoting. So it can be hard to determine that for sure. I think, Consumer Affairs Victoria, we've had an underquoting task force for 3 years now, so that's been a really strong focus for us. And I do believe we're making a difference, but clearly there's still a way to go, hence the recent announcements and hence the fact that we're still going with our activity. But I do also feel like we're making a difference. So I don't believe that today underquoting, happens in every campaign, but unfortunately it's still happening enough that we're still getting a lot of complaints about it.
Do you think that data's important? Because I think the impression out there in the marketplace is that it's really widespread, that every time a property exceeds the quoted price range, that is a potential case of underquoting. Do you think it's important to maybe communicate at some point with the public and the industry as to how many cases there actually are of underquoting?
Well, I don't know if we'll ever get the, exact figure, Dion, unfortunately. And I sort of understand the point you're making. But I guess also, we've sort of got here because, in my view, unfortunately, it did become a bit of culture and practice in the industry. For whatever reason, I don't think people were always trying to do the wrong thing, but it had become just the way that, the way that you secure clients, the way that you then run a campaign. It was just assumed that this was sort of part of the way you do things. And I think we lost sight of the fact that it is actually just misleading and deceptive conduct to advertise a price that is not realistic. So we're trying to get back to basics and say, actually, you just can't do that. You can't engage in any kind of misleading price representations. This is sort of one form of that. And it's time that we change practices and give people, accurate information when properties are for sale.
Fair.
Yeah.
So the question I've got for you is, there's been a few announcements in recent weeks around changes to the legislation. I think there's a little bit of confusion out there as to what is actually legislation right now and what is going to be a discussion piece in Parliament next year. Give us a little bit of information around what is actually law now.
Yes, I think that's a really good question, Dion. So the government has made announcements, but there aren't any changes until the Victorian Parliament passes legislation and it becomes law. So at the moment, the current laws that have been in place for a number of years now, I referred to those 2017 reforms. They are the laws. So they should be pretty well understood by the industry now, I would say. So they do have requirements around, setting a reasonable estimate of a selling price when you first engage a client, making sure your advertising aligns with that, making sure that you publish a statement of information, assessing comparable properties to inform that and listing those.
Comparable properties,
So those requirements haven't changed, and the basics of underquoting and the definition haven't changed. So it's still referred to as essentially you need to advertise and not advertise lower than either the estimate of the selling price that you provided to your client, the vendor, or it can't be lower than an offer that you've actually rejected.
Or rejected,
Or if you know your client's asking price or reserve price, it can't be lower than that. So that hasn't changed. Probably the key thing that has actually changed in recent months is that we have reissued the guidance around comparable properties. So again, the laws around that haven't changed, but we did notice through our task force that unfortunately in some cases we feel that agents were cherry picking comparable properties. So there's a technical definition. It has to be a property that's sold if you're in Melbourne within 2 kilometres and within the last 6 months. But in a lot of suburbs where there's a lot of activity, there's more than 3 comparable properties that you could base your estimate on. And unfortunately, we saw some agents that we think were, clearly passing over properties that were similar to the property that they'd been engaged to sell and sort of picking properties that had sold for lower prices for various reasons. So we've reissued those guidelines to be crystal clear about how you need to pick the most comparable properties if there's more than 3 available to choose from.
So just to be clear, they're the only changes or the only updates in recent months.
That's right. And obviously the government has made announcements of their intention to legislate further changes, and there's a few actually that they announced, but I think the key one everyone's talking about is requiring agents to ask the client what the reserve price is 7 days out from an auction, and then needing to publicise that or advertise that or update your advertising in some way. The exact form of that, though, we don't actually know until a bill is introduced into Parliament. We're waiting to see.
Yeah, wonderful. So, I mean, that's obviously one option.
Yes.
That the government in Victoria have is to regulate when a reserve price is disclosed.
Yes.
There are different ways in which other states are currently managing this, such as in Queensland, where they don't even disclose a price at all.
That's right.
Why is it that isn't a discussion point or an option?
Well, I think we hear, a lot about that approach as well. And, I've heard sort of mixed views about that approach in Queensland. Some saying, well, at least it means you're not putting a misleading price out there and buyers have to choose for themselves. But I've also heard a lot of people say that that leads to quite poor conduct in Queensland also because there's no price. But then, of course, potential buyers ask the agent what they think the property is going to go for, and so you can have the same sort of conduct that people complain about here occurring, but it's actually in the shadows and not public. So I don't know if that's necessarily a silver bullet for the problem either, the Queensland model, but I take your point that, these things can be subject of reasonable debate. And I assume that debate will continue in Victoria, certainly until any new laws are passed and possibly afterwards as well.
Okay. The discussion piece that we've been having that I'm involved with on LinkedIn and various other sources is that by disclosing the reserve before the auction, the vendor then loses its flexibility to make changes to what their reserve is before and after. What do you say to all those vendors out there who say, I don't want to disclose my reserve before the auction, I want to see what happens on the day and make a decision based on the activity that I've got?
Well, look, I think I've always held the view that one of the beauties of the auction system, well, there's a few. One is obviously that, the actual sale is transparent on the day and so on. But another is it gives people time to work up to the sale date. So I think it is reasonable that you run a campaign to test the market. You may not always know exactly what you think as a vendor your reserve or your asking price is going to be when you first put the property up for sale. So I don't think that's necessarily unreasonable. Now, it's not my decision, it's obviously government's decision to announce this reform. But I guess what government is signalling from that is that they feel that 7 days out, you've had a reasonable time to test the market and you should have some sense. And I guess they're signalling that the balance at that point should be that there needs to be clearer transparency to prospective purchasers as well about what the likely realistic asking price is going to be. So, not necessarily making a comment one way or the other about whether it's should be 14 days, 7 days, 3 days. I guess reasonable minds can differ, but I guess that's where the government has said they see the balance being struck.
So vendors having to disclose their price, that's obviously going to be something that is required of the vendor. Is there any discussion around buyers disclosing whether they're going to be bidding at the auction? I know that in New South Wales you have to register to bid. We don't have that here in Victoria. Is that a discussion piece at all?
Yeah, you're right. That's right. We don't have that law in Victoria, and I know that certainly the real estate industry has raised that issue, their desire to have registered bidders. Look, I can't necessarily speak for the government about what reforms they might contemplate, but certainly I think it's an interesting idea, and it's probably worth raising to see what the pros and cons are and whether that is also a beneficial reform. I mean, we talk a lot about underquoting, but there's a lot of issues that occur in the property market, and in my view, there's lots of different issues that we can be talking about to improve the experience. I mean, ultimately, our goal, certainly from my perspective as a regulator, it's not, to punish people for punishment's sake. It's not to have transactions be unfair for one or the other party. It's really just to ensure that we have a fair, competitive marketplace for everybody so that people can kind of get on with their lives, get on with these transactions in a way that's reasonable and transparent. So anything that's going to help with that, I think we should be open to.
I think that's really important. I think that's always it's important to make sure that we keep up to date with what obviously the consumers are saying, the feedback that you're getting, and you're obviously getting lots of complaints about underquoting.
Yes.
My question is, how are we now supposed to communicate all these new laws and changes to the public? It's one thing for the industry to be, I think it's the industry's responsibility to look up what the reforms are and be across that, right? So there's the question around what is Consumer Affairs doing to educate the industry. But what are we doing to educate consumers? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication as to what is considered underquoting and what is not, which is probably leading to the number of complaints that you're getting.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I probably, have a range of sort of answers to it, Dion. So in one sense, I would say that it is actually really important that the industry and estate agents take this seriously, understand the law and comply, because ultimately it's a profession, and it's understood that professions, one of the key requirements to be a profession is that you understand your legal obligations and that you comply with them. And there's a lot of privilege that comes with it. You have to have a license, and then you get a bit of a competitive advantage in what is quite, can be a really great industry to work in. So I do think it's really important that agents take those obligations seriously, and they are really the first port of call in terms of understanding and complying with obligations.
Yes.
But I don't disagree with you that there's always work we can do to educate the public more broadly. And my view is we all have a part to play in making sure that the market operates fairly for all. So vendors can play a part in this sort of conduct too. They're, wanting to hold things close to their chest and go along with an advertising campaign that maybe they also understand is not necessarily totally transparent. So we need to all do better as well. And buyers also, I don't think there's any excuse for misleading buyers. There never is. But at the same time, you should always make sure that you inform yourself, you educate yourself. I always still encourage buyers, look, you need to take your own responsibility for your shopping around as well. Get to know the market, understand what's going in your local area and what the likely prices are going to be. It's not all on just being told. You do need to do your own homework. So I think we all do have a part to play. And going on programs like yours, Dion, is just one way that I can do my bit to try and educate people about that.
I definitely think there needs to be a lot more communication between the government or Consumer Affairs with respect to where buyers can actually access this information. I think there needs to be a little bit more press around these changes so that buyers are going out there on the weekends actually understanding what underquoting actually is, and that way they feel like there's a... I think what's happened with all the regulation changed over the last 20 years is it's actually bred a little bit of, if not a lot of mistrust in agents, and that really puts us as the agent who, and most of, I would argue, a significant proportion of the industry doing the right thing, it paints almost the entire industry with the same brush. So I think that there needs to be a lot of work done with respect to the communication between Consumer Affairs and the government as to what is underquoting and what is not. 20 years of discussing underquoting. I was in my early 20s when the first case in Victoria was actually challenged. Do you think these changes will be the end of this conversation around underquoting? Do you think this will solve the problem once and for all?
Yeah, great question. Look, I've been on the record as saying that there's not necessarily one silver bullet to this issue, and I do believe that. So that's not to say that the reforms wouldn't make a positive difference, but ultimately, like I said, it's actually all of us working together that's going to eliminate this practice. I do think it is getting better, and I do agree with you that not all agents are doing it, and a lot of agents are really sick of it and the way that it's undermining the reputation of the industry. Totally agree. We know that at least a third of the reports we get at Consumer Affairs Victoria about underquoting are coming from other agents. So they're sick of seeing people they're trying to compete with fairly sort of undermining that fair competition by engaging in these practices. So we all need to work together to stamp it out. But ultimately it is going to take a concerted effort from all of us, including the industry, to say, we've got to adjust the way we the customer practice that we've fallen into around this. We just need to accept that prices should be advertised in a way that is actually realistic, and then we let the market decide. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nicole, thank you very much for joining me today. This program is brought to you by Bessa & Co Estate Agents. This is Ticker. We'll be right back.